probably can go over the details again about when this program was put in place by the legislature, how it was rolled out. And I think anything you want to share, of course, would be helpful. We're particularly interested in, I think, knowing whether you've got, to the extent that you have data to support it, whether this was a program that was a good investment, whether we can see a good return on the investment the state made.
Yeah, happy to.
All right. Well, we have a couple of committee members who had to step out. I think we can go ahead and get started.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me today. Abby Willard, for the record, Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets. I'm the Ag Development Division Director. Sorry to not be there in person. And yeah, this is my skin cancer recovery look with the bandage. It happens when you spend time outside, and would rather be gardening than sitting in your office if you had the choice. I'm here to talk today at the committee's request about the agriculture development grants that were funds appropriated to the Agency of Agriculture in fiscal year 24. So I thought that we could do a quick review of how the program came to be, a little bit about the focus, and then show some of the demand that accompanied that appropriation, some of the impacts that we have to date. And I think essentially we haven't talked about this project since January of 2025 in the committee, so entertain any questions that you might have. How does that sound, Chair and committee members?
I think that sounds good.
Okay, great. So as I said, we haven't chatted about the Ag Development Grant Program since January of 2025. And since then, many of the projects that were funded by this fiscal year 24 appropriation have been completed. So I get to share some of those outcomes with you, which I'm excited about. In quick recap, I'll just share how the Ag Development Grant Program came to be and what it intended to do. So in 2023, the Future of Ag Commission report recommended making an infrastructure investment in diversified agriculture and in growing ag industries, and particularly focusing on meat production and processing, the produce industry, and the maple industry. That investment in infrastructure to help diversify and grow industries in addition to dairy in Vermont was also highlighted in the Vermont Ag and Food System Strategic Plan that was created by the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund and the Vermont Food Security Roadmap. So in fiscal year 24, this body and legislature responded by appropriating $2.3 million to the Agency of Agriculture for the creation of these agriculture development grants. So we referred to them as ADG grants, and said that 25% could be dedicated to the maple industry and the remaining allotment would be to the meat and produce industries. The direction around the program was essentially to make infrastructure investments to support the growth and expansion of these sectors within Vermont's ag economy. So the approach that the Ag Agency took was in the fall of 23, we released the request for applications for competitive applications in the maple industry. So we chose to do that one first to have it be in advance of the maple growing season. And we had projects that started in early 2024, and all of the funded maple projects ended by November of 2025, so last year. We decided to do a slightly different timeline for the meat and the produce industry. We released a competitive request for applications for those two sectors in January of 2024, so a little bit later, with projects that started that next April of 2024. And most of those are slated to have either been completed by now or wrapped up actually in 2 days at the end of April. There were some projects that have requested an extension and will end this September. when we launched the ag development grants, we were really clear on our website, in the webinar, with correspondence with interested businesses, that there was some overlap with the Working Lands program and focus and eligibility. And so we were clear that applicants needed to either apply, that they could apply to both Working Lands and the ag development grants, but they would only receive one award for that year. So that was something that we anticipated, that we could have businesses apply to both, and then we would give them the opportunity to make a selection. So that's sort of the foundation of the program. I'm going to now just go to the next slide that shows a little bit of the demand. So the oversubscription and demand for this program was impressive and extreme. So it was in, the timing of fall and winter of 23-24 was just following our 23 flood season. So I think businesses were both feeling really vulnerable around climate, and also had been subject to a couple of years of COVID investment. So I think really thinking about infrastructure development, market growth, and expansion opportunities. Overall, between the four, it's three different sectors, but there's meat producers and meat processors, produce industry, and maple. We received over 500 applications requesting just under $44 million. And in the end, we funded 25 projects at just over 2.1 million. We reserved the remainder, a few $100,000, to support the staff that administered this program, which are in the Ag Development Division team at the agency. So what you can see in this table is that maple far received the greatest demand. So there was actually over 350 total applications. 331 of them were deemed eligible based on the criteria for the program. And again, there was a statutory limit of 25% could be spent in the maple sector. So $542,000 was awarded to the maple community. Meat production and processing had a total of 96 applications received, which the demand for that was just under 15 million. And we funded $577,000 towards the meat sector. And then produce received 76 total application requests, totaling over $11 million. And this was the largest sector investment. So just over $1 million was awarded to the produce community. So again, you can see over on the far right, kind of like the key types of projects that the Ag Development grants funded within each sector, as well as the project range. So you can, and we'll talk about this in a minute, but some were very small projects, less than $20,000, and others in the larger category of $100,000 up to $240,000.
I've got a question here.
Yes.
Representative O'Brien.
Yeah, I mean, I just wondered how your team came up with a metric. It sounds like a torturous process to go through 503 applications and end up with 25.
Gosh.
Like it must have been so hard to find those final 25.
Yeah, it's a great question. An oversubscription to our granting programs is not a new phenomenon within the Ag Development Division and our Economic Development Program. So we're pretty well equipped at utilizing the application process. Review, we have 3 reviewers on every application. We have sector-based review discussions to review all the applications. We have, a pretty consistent approach of like, there's a clear top tier set of applicants that we don't discuss at first. There's a group of applications that are in the poorer scoring category that we don't discuss at first. And then we really focus on those in the middle where there's just a little bit of variation, and then make hard decisions, frankly, about impact, about need of the business, about having some diversity of, you know, again, if it was maple, we wanted to have some that were sap only, some that were syrup producers, some that were value added. We wanted to capture different parts of the state, as I mentioned. We wanted to cover in the meat sector, both those that were in the production arena, so they were raising livestock, but also some that were processing meat. So yeah, it is a hard, balance. I would say there's a bit of science to it, and it's really dependent upon kind of the review committees that are selected. I'm not looking at that data right now to answer. I think we talked about this last January, not that I would expect any of us to remember, but like how many reviewers participated in the Ag Development Grant Program review. It was hundreds of, you know, agency staff, partners, industry experts that participated in the review of those 500 applications.
It just occurred to me, it must have been that much harder too when, you know, we're familiar with working lands and that process you're involved in. You often say how in those applicants, you know, you might have somebody who's close but isn't quite ready. And so they apply the next year. So there's that sort of keep going, you're going to get there. Whereas this was a one-off. And I just wondered what happened to some of the really great applications that didn't, you know, ultimately get a reward.
Yeah, it's a great question. So on the last slide, I only have 4 slides, so I'm keeping kind of like the presentation piece brief so we can have more conversation. But on the last slide, I guess I can share it now. We, just to give you a sense, we looked at all of the applications and confirmed how many scored by the review team. So that again, each application is reviewed by 3 reviewers. We looked at the number of applications that scored 80 out of 100, so 80% or higher. Out of the 503 applications, 178 applications scored 80% or higher. Usually somewhere around 80 is sort of like that cutoff of, if it's 80 or higher, like that's considered a pretty high quality application. We looked at, you know, it met all of the targets of being ready as a business, shovel ready as a project, high value, high impact, likely to have meaningful contribution to the business and or to the sector. So to have 35% of the applications in that 80, a score of 80 or higher, was really challenging. So that meant that $22 million of demand met that criteria of being considered a high quality application. So 22 million out of the 44 million of requests. So we turned down a lot of great projects and many high quality proposals. We shared those businesses. We offered those businesses other funding opportunities. That's something that both our program staff, as well as very specifically, we have a navigator role at the agency that is their targeted responsibility is to connect businesses to appropriate resources, whether that's business support and technical assistance or other financial assistance options if they were ineligible for one of our grants or didn't compete or were even a high quality, in this case, application that just we didn't have the appropriation to support it. So that's a big part of the work that our development division does. What I don't know, because we don't really track this, is how many of those ag development grantees that were, or applicants that were not awarded ended up applying for and receiving other state funds or other state or other federal funds to support that same project. The other thing that we do is we use this data of demand to kind of like make the case for our priorities as an agency of like where we see the real need and opportunity for increased investment, particularly in infrastructure. So, you know, we had hoped to see, you know, additional ag development grant investments in subsequent years. We actually applied for congressionally directed spending of federal dollars, you know, like kind of the earmark appropriation dollars, just to reach out just to this targeted population of applicants that didn't receive a grant. Because we said, wow, we already know these are high quality applications. They've already applied. We know exactly what they want to do. If we can find another funding source to augment that, we don't even have to do another competitive request for applications. We'll just fund the next tier of high quality proposals. Unfortunately, neither of those kind of explorations panned out, and we did not see a state or a federal grant opportunity to invest in these businesses. One thing that did happen was USDA released the Resilient Food System Infrastructure grants to our agency as a cooperative agreement. It was targeting middle of the supply chain. So we did fund some equipment purchases on farms and at on site with businesses, but much of those awards were targeted larger middle of the supply chain infrastructure, which could be around food hubs or processing infrastructure. So most of those projects the equipment grants were smaller, the infrastructure grants were quite large. So I'm sure that there were some of these applicants that ended up being those USDA Resilient Food System Infrastructure grantees. So that was another kind of opportunity that we directed these unsuccessful applicants towards.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Great question. So to give you a status update on the 25 projects that were funded, 18 of the 25 are complete. 3 will wrap up their expenditures by the end of this month, the end of April, and then they have some time to prepare their final report and send us their final information. So we won't see those kind of impacts for another, 30 to 60 days. And 3, have been extended to the end of September. So they asked for an amendment based upon, purchasing of equipment or circumstances within their business to extend the timeline on their project. And then one project was actually canceled. So in addition to the 25 that we funded that you see in this chart, we actually had some, because of one cancellation, and some projects that wrapped up and they were under budget because we are a deliverables-based granting program. If we have projects that are finished and they don't invoice for all of their needs, we were able to offer an additional grant round that met the same criteria of the Ag Development Grant kind of purpose and statute. And so we created a very simple $26,000 harvest and post-harvest food safety grant program. We did that just this last year, starting in January. So the eligibility for those remaining and unobligated funds was to focus on meat and produce operations that are under regular inspection, either under the produce safety rule or with USDA, or under inspection for meat slaughter and processing by the agency. And our intent was to really focus on, did businesses receive some sort of food safety recommendation as a part of a regulatory site visit that we could use grant funds to address? So what I mean by that is they were inspected and there was this project that they needed to do to meet produce safety standards or to be in compliance with their meat inspection. And it was an experiment of something that we've really wanted to focus on, which is blending the regulatory role of our agency with the economic development side of the work that we do. So if we have regulators that are out there and inspectors that are saying, this is something that you need to work on around food safety, could we have a granting program that then provides support and the cost share to that business to be able to make those improvements? So 3 projects were funded with that additional $26,000. One was a meat operation, one was a produce operation, and one made a value-added product that had both produce and meat in it. So in the end, we ended up with 27 total projects. All will be wrapped up by November of this year, November of 2026. Please tell me if there's questions that I'm just not seeing hands. Otherwise, I'm happy to move to the next slide, which is to share some of the kind of grantee impacts.
Yeah, I think no raised hands here, so fine to move on, Abby.
So one of the things that our team kind of focused on over the last few weeks as we're sort of pulling together some of the results from the program was what kind of feedback did they receive from grantees just generally. Times are tough right now for ag businesses. You know, I think it's not surprising of the floods and the drought, economic decline, tariffs, increased cost of production. It's been challenging. Businesses are finding higher costs than they estimated and some even hidden costs that they didn't anticipate. And businesses are really grateful to have access to funds, particularly focused on infrastructure. And we also heard from businesses that construction and equipment installation took longer than they expected. So I think every grantee that we've heard from experienced some delays, some unanticipated delays. We also kind of confirmed that making infrastructure investments is a really impactful way to support businesses. And that those infrastructure investments can be quite varied. Some of them can be quite small. So, and again, we saw that in that array of, you know, less than $20,000 projects up to almost 245,000. Some of the small on-farm or at facility investments can also be really impactful, and that we saw that and can be really meaningful to a business. We saw that similarly when the Dairy Business Innovation Center made bulk tank investments on dairy farms. So small cost, but really meaningful investment. And then some of the larger projects where you're really making improvements to their operation and their flow and their efficiency. Again, we saw that having a really valuable impact when you're thinking of that middle of the supply chain that's solving processing, aggregation, storage, or distribution solutions. And as I mentioned, that resilient food system infrastructure, or RFSI is the acronym that we use. Those were, again, those larger supply chain projects that are also really impactful. In the ag development grants, most of the impacts were in energy use reduction, production efficiency, workforce development, and sales growth. In the maple sector, most of the projects were focusing on some degree of climate resiliency. We talked about that, and it wasn't surprising since this release of the maple RFP was right after the floods of 23. And we think climate was really on people's minds, and energy consumption and aiming for reduction was really prevalent and relevant for businesses at that time. And then in the meat and produce projects, most of those projects were focused on either operational efficiency and or capacity expansion, which again isn't surprising, as they're two sectors that are really trying to grow and scale and really thinking about how they can be more efficient and how they can, you know, achieve more economy of scale to reach new markets and be more profitable. So here are 6 specific examples that we wanted to just share with you of funded projects. So Bourbon Maple, they installed a new vacuum pump for increasing sap production and harvesting, and they saw pretty substantial both reduction in energy use and increased in sap flow to the sugar house. Fifth Quarter was a meat applicant or meat grantee that focused on renovating and expanding a processing space and cooling capacity at their facility. Their outcomes were really focused on efficiency in production and workforce expansion, being able to hire 2 new positions while also being more efficient and increasing production. Dalestead Farm in Maple was a maple operation that upgraded their reverse osmosis equipment and added some sap and syrup storage tanks. So their greatest impact was a reduction in fuel use, which was exciting for them as a business to see towards reaching their sustainability goals. Bros Market was a meat processing applicant or grantee that upgraded their HVAC system and saw substantial increases in their packing efficiency. Blue House Mushrooms was a produce business that their application expanded their indoor production space with this, sole goal of increasing sales, which they saw significant growth in the 2 years between when they applied for the grant and when they submitted their final material. So sales growth from 91,000 annually to over 225,000. And then the last example to share was Foxglove Farm. Also a maple operation. Their project was used to purchase upgraded evaporator, so new equipment, and they expanded the footprint and size of their sugar house. So they also saw a reduction in fuel use. In this case, it was, that wood is how they were heating their sugar house, and significant labor savings by not having to burn as much wood meant they didn't need to cut as much wood or make as much available for their sugaring operation. So really appreciating kind of that like workforce labor savings that they achieved. So those are some of the highlights we wanted to share. The last slide is kind of like what we touched on earlier, which was just sort of speaking to the number of high quality applications that we received. And given the 2.1 million that we had to award, that just under 5% of the total number of project applications received were able to be funded under that one appropriation. And again, as I mentioned, there were numerous kind of strategies that we utilized to sort of share this demand to hopefully result in supplemental resources to kind of like build and, hopefully reach more of that 44 million of demand that we didn't have the resources to fund. I think an important last kind of thought that I'd offer on this program is that it's the first industry-specific infrastructure investment program that we've ever run at the agency, where we were comparing maple operations to maple operations, produce operations to produce operations, and the same with meat, as opposed to other economic development programs where the objectives are, efficiency or conservation measures, and we're looking across sectors. It was really exciting and meaningful to be able to be meeting and to be looking at applications within their own sector, and hope that we have an opportunity to do that again. I think there was real merit and value in that opportunity that this program created.
Abby, you can stay on this slide, I guess. I wanted to ask you a couple of things. One is about the 25% cap that we put on the program for Maple grantees, and just noting how the demand, as we can see right here from the Maple sector, was more than 25% of their funding requests. And I know we had our reasons, I think back, and we had quite a bit of discussion about that. But now, like in retrospect, from your perspective, had we not had that 25% cap written in, would you have been inclined to spend more of the 2.1 million on Maple grants?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. Each sector could have utilized the entire appropriation of on their own. So there were high quality, ready projects within produce, within meat, and in maple that exceeded $2.1 million each. So I think that we could have we could have used, I think we said $22 million of high quality, 80% or higher scoring applications were reviewed. Um, so just acknowledging that there was such demand across all three sectors. I think if we didn't have the Maple cap, we would have funded more than $543,000 of Maple projects. For sure. There were great proposals, and we don't always see that demand coming from the Maple community, even in other grant programs that we offer where Maple is eligible. And I think it was because the focus of, and this is where I'll maybe go back to the first slide, because the focus of these infrastructure investment grants were on production and processing upgrades, specifically looking at infrastructure improvements. It didn't necessarily need to have to reach a new market. It didn't need to increase sales, frankly. I mean, though we did see that sales production happened, increase in sales and in production happened, but that wasn't an eligibility criteria for applicants, which is something that's different, say, to the Working Lands program. So I think these types of key themes of investment areas really spoke to businesses as to what they were needing and where they were hoping to be able to make a meaningful investment.
So the second question, thank you for that. And the second question is related, I guess, and it's really, you're not going to, I don't think you're going to have an easy answer, but just in terms of evaluating the bang for the buck, project by project or sector by sector here, if we were in a position to fund another 2 million or any number, going forward, and somebody, you or the hundreds of people who were evaluating the applications, had to look at this now. Have we gained information so that if you were tasked with choosing the next set of projects, 25 projects, you'd be able to say, oh, okay, now we've seen what the results were here. Not just that there's demand. I mean, I understand that if you went out and said, we've got $2 million, you're going to probably have lots of people coming saying, I'd like a piece of that.
Yeah.
But how do we know now? What do we know now, or might we know from looking at the results here that would help you with the next round, the next time we do something like this?
Yeah, let me think about that. This is where our program team, I think, would offer a really solid response to that as the folks that were, more intimately engaged in the day-to-day. I know we've talked about the fact that we would probably aim to be more specific, which is a little bit of our learned lesson, I think, like more generally in our economic development programs, is that it takes effort and time for businesses to put in a proposal. And I won't say that this was a waste of people's time, because I think many found it valuable to think about what infrastructure investments they may want to make on their business. But I think that for businesses, it was also really, time consuming in many cases. And it would be nice if we had a narrower kind of eligibility focus of our program so that we didn't necessarily see as many applications come through. I think we really liked, as I said, the industry specific or the industry by industry evaluation. I think that was like really helpful. And it felt more equitable to be comparing a maple operation to a maple operation, et cetera. It also, and we talked about this from the beginning, was that like this almost served as an industry outreach effort. This was an opportunity for us to hear from so many businesses, particularly in Maple, about what their needs were within the sector. We had 330, actually 350 Maple applications that told us what it was that they wanted to invest in. And I think there was also, while I said it would be helpful to be narrower, I think we were also rewarded by hearing that production and processing upgrades and equipment purchases were really what that industry needs. And, we saw similar feedback at a slightly lesser extent in the meat and the produce sector. But it almost was like a survey of the industry of like, tell us what your needs are. And the application was relatively simple. It wasn't as complex as some of our more established programs. Or complex of, our federal award requests. The other thing that I would say, though, the difference is that, and we've talked about this in this committee a fair bit, of the value of having a year-over-year expectation of a grant program being available, that allows a business to make thoughtful decisions where they can say, I'm not going to apply to this program this year because I'm focusing on, marketing, or I'm focusing on, workforce, or, changing our labels, or some other kind of priority of the business, but we're going to apply next year, and they can count on the fact that that funding opportunity will be available to them year over year. And I think that continues to be the piece that is most concerning about like one-time appropriations or one-time programs. Are businesses don't know whether that opportunity will be there in the future. And so they apply, or they make the time, or they choose that as a priority to ensure that they put in an application to just hopefully see that their project is considered.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Representative O'Brien.
Yeah, related to that, Abby, I know with working lands, we often talk about matches, and no matches were required, right, for this?
There was no match required. Yes, that's correct.
Did that come up though in some applications that, that they volunteered, like if I need a new RO and I'll finance half of it if I could get this grant, and it would happen, or was that almost a detriment where you were like, no, we really want this grant to see through the whole project you propose in your application?
Yeah, I mean, we sort of anticipated that there could be some match discussion today, and again, I'll do my best to kind of represent sort of what I think our program staff saw in the applications and the proposals that were funded. I think it was nearly 80% of the grantees contributed something towards their project. So even with match not being required, most offered some sort of contribution of either their labor or serving as the general contractor on the project. One grantee example that one of our program managers pulled was they spent $40,000 of their own money to pour the concrete floor, which was outside this, it was related to the scope of their project, but that was their contribution. So using staff time, their own labor, was essential to kind of the completion of these projects. And I think there were a few examples where if an applicant, not all projects, like hit the cap amount. They didn't all apply for the maximum amount. For those that did apply for the full grant amount, they shared that a match requirement would have made this particular grant inaccessible to them, as they didn't have the cash on hand or the additional available labor capacity to offer the match on the project. And that's when, again, our team kind of did some really thoughtful kind of consideration of the sectors and acknowledged that, most of these businesses have a seasonality to their income. And there are times of the year where they just don't have the cash flow to be able to guarantee kind of a cash match on a larger project like this. And we also learned from grantees that they were impacted by the 2025 drought, or the downturn in the market impacted their business. As we talked about, tariffs and increased material costs or cost of production increases really impacted the business's bottom line. And if that meant that they, on top of those unforeseen and kind of like calculated costs, also needed to provide match, it may have made, and in many cases, the project likely impossible for them to complete. So I know the committee's had lots of conversations around match. I would say the overarching feedback from this particular program is that not requiring match didn't mean that a business didn't have an investment or skin in the game. They were committed, they had and made a contribution, and that actually extended the scope and the impact of their project. But had we required match, we wouldn't have seen some of these same proposals submitted. And it was nice to see some of those, smaller, more realistic projects come through.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Great. Anything else that you wanted to say about it, Abby?
I think only just like we really liked this program in many ways. I think it was fun to meet a different population of applicants in some ways, folks that we hadn't seen applying for working lands or the Dairy Innovation Center or specialty crop lot grants or larger proposals. I think we liked the variety. We liked having some small projects, valued seeing some larger projects, and hope that we get to do something of this same scale and focus in the future. This really is, I think, where there's great value in the viability and reliability of our ag economy. I honor and acknowledge the majority being due to the dairy sector, but also hear from many businesses that are looking to do something different for a variety of reasons. And looking at meat, maple, and produce opportunities continues to kind of attract certain entrepreneurs and business owners in Vermont. And what we can do to support them, I think, in many cases is directing them to financial assistance and helping them invest in infrastructure projects. So I was glad that we were able to do that through this program.
I've been thinking as we're having the conversation and hearing your presentation about working lands program, of course, and we had discussed, and I know Elizabeth was had expressed, willingness to more than a willingness to interested in coming back in to talk about measuring the results of that program and whether there were specific metrics, data points that the committee might want to see in the future. So I think that now, having had this conversation, it might have sort of primed us a little bit. And as we get into May and have some time where we're not rushing to get bills done, we're not doing that today, obviously, but we will be over the next couple of weeks, I think. Might be good to return to that and have Elizabeth come in, and we come in to just have another conversation with the committee about what we might want to see there, what would be helpful for you and for us.
To have that conversation. And I think that team has spent a lot of time looking at metrics, and again, have the advantage of 11 plus years of continuous data to be able to tell a pretty impactful story of what the Working Lands program is able to accomplish. And, you know, kind of I think at one point we had a table that we could share in addition to what you're talking about, Chair Durfee, of like for every $1 million invested, like what do we see for economic return? Like what do we likely see circulating in the type of projects that are funded? So yeah, I think there's some really great data that Working Lands has, having been funded year over year.
Good.
So
All
let's do
right.
that.
Well,
That'd be great.
thank you. Yeah, we'll be in touch about that.
Okay.
Thanks, Abby.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You're
Good luck.
feeling better.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
You're off.
See you
All
soon,
right.
person.
Take care.
All right, so we are about done for the day. I will just say that we are planning this trip tomorrow morning. It'll take up the morning. We'll be back here around 12 o'clock, not planning to have lunch there, although that may change once once we're there. We are on the floor at 1, and the notice calendar was a little longer than usual today. So I don't,
If 78% announcements
well, yeah, yes, that's always true.
or red.
Yeah, so we do have one item on the agenda for tomorrow in the committee after the floor. I just wanted to make sure everybody was aware of that.
Don't sprint out of here.
It's tentative, but yeah, check before you sprint out. Yes.
So I have to meet with my intern tomorrow.
Okay,
It's like the last time that I can do it, and she's coming at lunchtime. So if there's a chance that the committee wants to have a fun lunch somewhere.
Yeah.
Then I should probably drive home. So
okay. All right, well, okay, yes, you can certainly do that.
And then,
Yeah, because I don't know what the committee will want to do, but
Chair, if you and Patricia should let us know where the estimated location of departure is tomorrow morning.
yeah.
Um,
Okay, I think we'll figure that out and let everybody know.